Thanks to my Patreon supporters for making videos like this possible, as well as exclusive videos you can only get over there for as little as $1 a month. Thanks, and now on with the show. It almost feels impossible to effectively preview Shadow of the Erdtree. I mean, how do you begin to preview an expansion for a game like Elden Ring? We're already dealing with one of the most expansive games released in recent memory, with what I'm willing to bet is even a large portion of its most dedicated fanbase still yet to personally experience everything that The Lands Between has to offer. And those parts of the game that people have experienced, what areas they prefer and what problems they might have with the base game, all subject to myriad individual choices made in terms of highly specific builds, for example. And now, with the upcoming and much anticipated Shadow of the Erdtree, we suddenly expand on that original dilemma fractally. More areas, harder bosses, more equipment to experiment with, more variables with which your own experience is granularly altered. And as a result, it can feel like that individual experience becomes harder to convey to an audience with any real degree of universality. And this was the problem posed to myself and a number of fellow creators and journalists as publisher Bandai Namco flew us all out to Paris, presenting a surreal scenario in which a church had been lined with gaming rigs under the strict gaze of this dude, because I guess Elden Ring and Gothic architecture kind of fit well together, I suppose, despite the fact we have plenty of similar buildings way closer to home, also that we could get hands-on with Erdtree, exploring what From Software has spent close to 2 years meticulously crafting. And as it turns out, the answer to the more logistical side of that initial question, how do you preview Elden Ring DLC, was fairly simple. We were given a choice of 3 builds, Warrior, Knight and Sorcerer, each set to level 150, with the team stating that this was simply an arbitrary number they settled on for the preview. You can access this thing at any point after beating Radahn and Mohg, with different stats prioritized for different classes. We were told that we had access to 2 large but discrete areas within the gigantic new world that Erdtree provides, Castles Bellurat and Ensis, and that we had 3 hours to do and see what we could. But even still, this simplified structure of the event could not prepare me for what was to come. A fact which, combined with the inherent weirdness of any preview, in which you're in a strange place, constantly aware you're being watched, all resulted in a rather frantic few hours that felt like it absolutely flew by, and saw the biggest struggle become one of how to even begin to convey what actually went down in that narrow preview window. And so, this preview isn't going to be a totally comprehensive breakdown of absolutely everything to be found in the expansion, just an honest recollection of the things that I personally experienced that stuck out to me. I'm sure there will be plenty of ultimate breakdowns and the like releasing right now that I'd highly recommend checking out as well, but man, there's just so much to dig into here. And I guess one of the first things that stands out going into this DLC is that it is going to be difficult for most players, I imagine. Almost everyone I spoke to had booted up Elden Ring in the days prior to either get to the DLC access point or simply to brush up on controls. And if you haven't, this is something I'd recommend, as regaining the muscle memory of Elden Ring's unique and at times unforgiving rhythm after almost 2 years away from it was a process unto itself. Cue me wandering out into this vast new plane, genuinely awed by the vista before me, ephemeral graves dotting the landscape and stretching out into the distance further than you can see, lit by glowing rays popping through the cracks of an Erdtree far removed from the tantalizing golden glow of its base game counterpart. A tableau as dreamlike and beautiful as it is dauntingly ominous. And here I am, blissfully taking it all in, when suddenly one enemy appears out of nowhere and proceeds to take me out with just one flurry of hits. I try again, valiantly fighting my way through my new rival, only to come across a walking fire pit, I guess, before it unceremoniously boots booted me to death, and I hadn't even reached either of the 2 bespoke areas we were allowed to explore yet. In short, from the off, Shadow of the Erdtree is an experience that will require constant vigilance. The already occasionally overwhelming brutality of its base game jacked up tenfold, in a way that really didn't let up across the 3 hours of the preview. Regular enemies power themselves up and attack you in mobs, and the most unassuming of hostiles will often quickly punish you for your hubris in underestimating them. Seriously, despite the fact you can enter the DLC at any time after defeating the 2 mandatory bosses, if you haven't leveled Vigor to a reasonable degree, then you are going to struggle here. The warrior class I spent most of my time with had been leveled to 55 in that regard, the highest of any of the available builds, and it was still tough. My own character at home has 70 Vigor, and thanks to the fact I'm going to be going into the full thing on New Game Plus, where things are inevitably going to be more challenging, I am anxiously waiting to see if even leveling to that point will be enough. Harder than any enemy, however, was simply the option paralysis that overcame me for a bit during the preview. While most spells were obviously locked to the sorcerer, many of the new weapons were available to any build to experiment with, including all kinds of axes, spears, and greatswords, as well as what became a bit of a crowd favourite in the form of the new martial arts abilities, providing a flurry of melee attacks that could quickly drain an enemy's stance if utilised correctly. Importantly, the new combat options I tried, the wealth of new weapon arts available for example, all left me with the feeling that were I to get more time to practice, any one of them could become a new favourite. But alas, I had to balance my desire to thoroughly mess around with all of this stuff with, I guess, my professional need to see as much of the available content as possible. A plan which, given the challenge of said content, necessitated some honing of a momentarily viable build, a strategy of some kind. And for me, this came in the form of the backhand blade, a weapon that seemed to be the most agreeable compromise between damage output, attack speed, and reach. The latter two elevated further by its associated weapon art, Blind Spot. Now, this appeared in Dark Souls 3 in a different form, but here the effect is greatly exaggerated, essentially allowing you to dart to quickly dodge around an enemy and slice them from the side. A move that, when a specific rhythm was nailed, allowed for an effortless but deadly flow from one foe to another. It was really goddamn cool. And such efficiency is important if you have just 3 hours to see what this thing has to offer, because the 2 areas we were granted access to seemed at least as dense, if not more so, than some of the larger castle areas found in the base game. To give you an idea, Castle Ensis, seemingly the more difficult of the 2, reminded me of the Academy of Rea Lucaria, with its emphasis on sorcerers and magic, while the ruin of the more densely residential Bellurat brought to mind the rot and decay of Leyendell. And what really struck me about these areas is just how delightfully devious they are, inspiring a real old school mentality where you have to carefully check every visible corner and crevice before proceeding, because more so than the base game, you can guarantee there's something waiting to pounce at you. At the end of it all though, the 2 main bosses we then found ourselves up against are not afraid to lie in plain sight, with what I'm guessing was the majority of most previewers' time spent frantically switching between the 2 respective grace checkpoints, desperately trying to best either Divine Beast Dancing Lion, a flailing foe that flings various elemental hazards your way, or what felt like an altogether more balletic version of the Pontiff Sullivan fight from Dark Souls 3, with its emphasis on dual swords and a bombardment of magic. The Lion was by far the easier of the 2, with
the latter's
barrage of sword swings, their reach ultimately proving too unrelenting for me to best. And with 15 minutes of playtime left to go, I instead decided to aimlessly run around some more, mess around with some of my less frequently used combat toys, upon which I stumbled into a whole new lava dungeon I'd completely forgotten the team mentioning at the start, and my heart sank knowing I wouldn't get to fully explore it. My mind similarly raced regarding all the possibilities I'd missed, noticing a crack in the stone upon one of many upper pathways found in Bellurat, what secrets laid among its many traversable rooftops, offering a new perspective on the path I'd so arduously fought through moments prior. When we were told to put the controllers down, it dawned on me just how much I had failed to see, that I'm now failing at my job, I guess, to tell you about. But I suppose that's just it. If there's one thing to get excited about from this preview, it's not necessarily any single design element or enemy or piece of equipment, it's the fact that in a few weeks we will suddenly have all this new Elden Ring to decode, a whole new world brimming with secrets to uncover. It really seems like From Software used every bit of the 2 years since the base game's release to turn this into a reality. I spent 3 hours on 2 huge areas of this world, categorically did not see everything that those 2 areas had to offer, and at the end of the preview I remembered that these areas are a tiny part of this expansion's larger map. I was immediately reminded of that daunting feeling that set in when you realise that the map of Limgrave, an area that could house an entire game in itself, had so much more to go in how far that map would stretch out. And this isn't even to touch on the lore stuff that people like Vati or fellow Scott Smotown, who I was fortunate enough to meet on this trip, will be far better equipped than me to tell you about. And I suppose at the end of it all, above all else, that's how you get people to preview an expansion like Shadow of the Erdtree. Like the base game, you leave the people covering it resolutely overwhelmed in difficulty as well as the amount of options with which to overcome it. But most importantly of all, with the stomach-dropping fact that there is so much more to come that you cannot even begin to imagine, that you are but a blip within this cosmic enormity, and I, for one, could not be more excited. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, all that daft YouTube stuff. It really helps the channel and it means the world. A massive thanks as well to my patrons, who you can see on screen and are all getting access to exclusive, fully produced videos that aren't available here. Your continued support is what allows me to keep going with the work I do on this channel, and I seriously cannot express how grateful I am for that. You are all the best. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsuk, Michael Tritt, Alex O'Sullivan, Rickety Cricket, Cameron Siniseros, Don McLean, Urban Cheese, Charles J. Liu, Alistair Dunn, Vitautis Catharsis, Dolly Bowman, Young Condor, David Carsons, Tom Webster, Dana Sikowskis, Jordan Midler, Christopher Faherty, Nicholas Villeneuve, Yogesh Deshpande, Joe Lanzone, Leah Chinello, Captain Knussbrich, Dylan Robinson, Bryce Snyder, C-Page Melt Limited, David Björk, Nelwyn Palacios, Timothy Jones, Carr Christensen, Matthew Grover, Shardfire, Lynn Browning, Dallas Keane, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.